In this video, we're turning to one of the most influential moral theories in Western philosophy, utilitarianism. It's a type of consequentialism, meaning that the moral worth of an action is judged entirely on its outcomes or consequences. In simple terms, the right action is the one that produces the greatest amount of happiness and the least amount of suffering for the greatest number of people. That idea might sound like common sense. After all, we often justify our choices by saying something like, "it was for the best," or "it was for the greater good." But utilitarianism turns that everyday intuition into a systematic moral theory. The roots of utilitarian thinking go back to Epicurus in ancient Greece, who taught that happiness is achieved through the pursuit of pleasure and the avoidance of pain. But modern utilitarianism really begins with Jeremy Bentham, who tried to turn this idea into a rational moral system for society as a whole. Bentham argued that human beings are governed by two masters, pleasure and pain. He believed morality should be based on the principle of utility, which broadly says actions are right in proportion as they tend to promote happiness, wrong as they tend to produce the reverse of happiness. Here, happiness means pleasure and the absence of pain. Unhappiness means pain and the absence of pleasure. To make the principle practical, Bentham introduced something called the hedonic calculus, a method for measuring the amount of pleasure or pain an action might produce. He listed 7 criteria to consider: intensity, duration, certainty, propinquity, how soon the pleasure occurs, fecundity, whether it leads to more pleasure, purity, whether it leads to pain, and extent, how many people are affected. So, if you had to make a tough moral decision, say, choosing who to save in an accident or whatever, Bentham would ask you to calculate which choice brings about the greatest overall balance of happiness over pain for everyone affected. Bentham wanted the principle of utility to be built into laws, politics, and institutions. For instance, he thought that punishment should never be about revenge. It should only be used to reduce future suffering by deterring crime, reforming offenders, or protecting others. He even applied this reasoning to questions of justice, animal welfare, and social equality, arguing that the happiness of every individual counts equally, regardless of their class, gender, or background. However, Bentham's approach faced some challenges. His calculus assumes that pleasure can be measured like numbers, which is clearly difficult in real life. It also treats all pleasures as equal, whether it's enjoying sex, a great meal, or reading a poem. And because it focuses purely on outcomes, it can justify actions that seem deeply immoral, like lying or killing, if they produce more overall happiness. A generation later, John Stuart Mill refined Bentham's theory to make it more humane and philosophically sophisticated. Mill agreed with Bentham that happiness is the goal of morality, but he argued that not all pleasures are of the same kind or quality. For example, he says it is better to be a human being dissatisfied than a pig satisfied, better to be Socrates dissatisfied than a fool satisfied. For Mill, pleasures of the mind, such as art, learning, friendship, and moral reflection, are higher pleasures, while pleasures of the body, like eating or drinking or sex, are lower pleasures. He believed that people who had experienced both would always prefer higher pleasures because they are more fulfilling and lasting. Mill also introduced an important distinction between what he called act utilitarianism and rule utilitarianism. Act utilitarianism says that in every situation we should choose the specific action that produces the greatest happiness. For example, if lying in a particular case saves lives, then lying is the right thing to do. Rule utilitarianism, on the other hand, says that we should follow general rules that tend to produce the greatest happiness overall, like keep your promises or tell the truth. Even if breaking the rule might bring short-term happiness, following consistent moral rules creates greater trust and stability in the long run. Rule utilitarianism therefore avoids the problem of justifying injustice in individual cases, for example, sacrificing one innocent person to make others happy. Both Bentham and Mill believed that utilitarianism had practical importance for improving society. Bentham's ideas about equality helped inspire campaigns for women's rights, education reform, and even animal welfare. Mill took this further, arguing passionately for freedom, free speech, and the emancipation of women. He thought the principle of utility demanded that everyone's happiness be considered equally. No one's pleasure or pain counts more than anyone else's. Despite its intuitive appeal, utilitarianism faces some serious criticisms. Firstly, there is the calculation problem. How can we possibly measure or predict happiness for everyone affected by an action? Life is too complex for accurate calculations of this kind. The second is the problem of justice. Sometimes utilitarian reasoning can justify what we might otherwise think of as immoral acts, like punishing an innocent person if it benefits society. Another objection is the swine objection. Critics, including Kant, although Kant was before Mill, argued that a morality based on pleasure reduces humans to animals. Mill's idea of higher pleasures was an attempt to answer this. Then there is the minority problem. Because utilitarianism focuses on the majority's happiness, it can ignore or sacrifice the rights of minority groups. And after that, of course, we have the scope of consequences themselves. We can never know how far the consequences of any action will reach. One decision can have ripple effects that no one can reasonably foresee. Then, of course, there's the intention problem. And this points out that utilitarianism assesses actions only by their outcomes and therefore can ignore the agent's intentions. That leads to odd results. Imagine you take a plank of wood and throw it into the water. Your aim is to kill someone you hate you see in there, but by luck the plank lands not on them but within reach, and they use it to save themselves. Under a strict act utilitarian reading, your deed would be judged morally right because it produced a good consequence, despite your wicked intention. Now reverse the case. You throw the plank into the water trying to save your friend who is drowning, but you miss next to them and the plank strikes them on the head, causing their death. Your motive was noble, yet utilitarianism would count your action as wrong because of its tragic result. Critics say any moral theory that completely ignores intentions feels counterintuitive and misses an important part of our morality. A deeper objection questions what actually grounds the utilitarian idea of the greater good. If the theory is based on the equal moral worth of every human being, then allowing the death of some for the benefit of the many seems to contradict that very principle. It treats certain lives as expendable for the sake of aggregate happiness. Alternatively, if utilitarianism is not grounded in the equal moral worth of persons, then it needs some further justification for why we should accept a system that assigns different moral values to different human lives. Either way, the moral basis for sacrificing a few for the sake of the many appears far less convincing than utilitarians often suggest. Mill even tried to provide a proof for why happiness should be the goal of morality. He argued that since everyone desires happiness, and happiness is the only thing people seek for its own sake, it must therefore be the ultimate good. Just as something is visible because it can be seen, something is desirable because people desire it. This isn't a logical proof in the mathematical sense, but an appeal to common human experience, which can be fallible, of course. Nevertheless, utilitarianism remains one of the most influential ethical and political theories ever proposed. It's practical, focusing on what actually makes life better for the greatest number of people. At the same time, its weaknesses remind us that happiness alone may not be enough to define morality, especially since it can unjustly permit harm to innocent people if the payoff is the greater good. As John Stuart Mill at least recognised, but perhaps not without a certain amount of contradiction, true happiness comes not just from pleasure, but from cultivating the higher capacities of reason, empathy, and freedom. So in the end, utilitarianism gives us both a challenge and a guide, to think beyond ourselves, to weigh the consequences of our actions carefully, and to aim always at the greatest happiness for the greatest number.